You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. In the early spring of 1892, an older woman in a tiny Rhode Island town shuffled into her kitchen at 1 a.m. to make a late-night cup of tea. And as she passed by her front window, she saw a man riding on horseback down the dirt road outside holding up a flickering lantern. She recognized this man. He was the only doctor in town, and she could tell he was headed towards a large farm at the end of the road. And the woman had heard rumors that the farmer's son was deathly ill. She knew a house call in the middle of the night was not a good sign, but she also knew the doctor could not save the farmer's son. However, she could. So she threw on her coat, lit her own lantern, and set off into the night. From Ballen Studios in Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. And for this week's special Halloween episode, we're exploring something even more terrifying, the supernatural. For centuries, people believed that monsters, demons, and other horrors could cause deadly diseases and all kinds of misery. Nowadays, we tend to reject those explanations as ignorance and superstition, but for one New England farming family in the 1800s, that distinction wasn't so clear. Were they being plagued by a mysterious disease, or were they actually being preyed on by a creature thought only to exist in legend? So, if you like today's story, tell the follow button that you want to play the Floor is Lava game with them, but be sure to hide thumbtacks all over the room before you start playing. This episode is called She Haunts Me. On a spring morning in 1889, a 29-year-old doctor named Harold Metcalf was sitting in his parlor in the tiny town of Exeter, Rhode Island, when he heard his telegraph machine start clicking. He got up, walked over to the large metal machine, and watched it slowly print text onto a long, thin piece of paper. When it finished printing, Dr. Metcalf tore off the paper and read the telegram. It was a message from one of his neighbors, a farmer named George Brown. George said in this telegram that his only son, 22-year-old Edwin, had fallen ill, and he desperately needed Dr. Metcalf's help. The doctor let out a long sigh. He knew the Browns well. They'd once been a happy family of 9, with George, his wife, their 6 daughters, and their son, but Dr. Metcalf was all too aware of the tragedy that had struck the family over the past few years. 7 years ago, George's wife had come down with a mysterious disease that some locals called the White Death. It caused horrible symptoms like chronic fevers, extreme weight loss, and uncontrollable coughing. People with the disease grew pale and weak, and they got so emaciated that they looked like skeletons. It was like the disease literally drained the life out of them. Now, there were a lot of supposed treatments for the White Death, things like riding on horseback every day or drinking brown sugar mixed with water, but Dr. Metcalf knew these remedies did not work. In fact, he knew there was just no proven way to cure the White Death. Now, Dr. Metcalf had tried to help George's wife 7 years earlier by prescribing healthy food and exercise, but she still just kept on getting sicker. And in fact, she would die a year later, and then almost immediately afterwards, one of George's daughters also began showing symptoms of the dreaded disease. And again, Dr. Metcalf tried to help, but there was nothing he could do, and she also died within just a few months. Even though Dr. Metcalf knew the White Death was basically incurable, he still felt guilty for not being able to help George and his loved ones. And now, after reading George's telegram, Dr. Metcalf feared that Edwin might be the latest member of the Brown family to contract the deadly disease. But there was only one way to find out. Dr. Metcalf quickly packed his medical bag, threw a saddle on his horse, and raced off towards the Browns' farm. 15 minutes later, Dr. Metcalf trotted his horse along a thin country road in Exeter. To his right, he saw a vast field overgrown with weeds, with a crumbling country house right in the center. It was once a prosperous farm, but was now abandoned. The sight made Dr. Metcalf sad. He'd lived in Exeter his whole life, and he'd watched the quaint farming community turn into sort of a ghost town. The Civil War and the White Death had decimated the community, leaving only a third of the population alive. In fact, these days, the town was more commonly known by its nickname, Deserted Exeter. After riding for a few more minutes, Dr. Metcalf reached a modest house on 40 acres of farmland. He knocked on the door, and right away George Brown answered. He looked haggard, and he quickly led Dr. Metcalf to Edwin's bedroom. Inside the room, the doctor saw Edwin's wife and 5 remaining sisters crowded around a big 4-poster bed. Edwin was lying on the mattress in plain sight, but Dr. Metcalf barely could recognize him. The once husky farmhand had become bony and pale. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes were glassy, and when he tried to speak, he fell into a violent coughing fit. It was obvious to everyone, including the doctor, that Edwin had been gripped by the White Death. As Edwin tried to catch his breath, his father, George, approached the side of the bed and looked at the doctor and asked if there was anything he could do. Dr. Metcalf began rattling off his regular treatment plan, healthy food and exercise, but George stopped him. He said they'd already tried those things with his wife and his daughter and they hadn't worked. There had to be something different they could try. Dr. Metcalf hesitated, but then he said, yeah, there was another option. But he told them it was an experimental treatment, and so he couldn't guarantee it would work. George said he didn't care. At this point, he was willing to try anything to help Edwin. So Dr. Metcalf explained that some physicians believed that the White Death was caused, or at least was made worse, by living in humid climates, like Rhode Island. So it might help if Edwin moved out of Rhode Island and went somewhere with completely different weather. The doctor suggested Colorado Springs, Colorado, because it was a mountain town with very dry air and high elevations, and so it would be a drastic change from Rhode Island. But there was one really obvious problem. To get to Colorado, Edwin would have to travel 2,000 miles, and this would mean days and days of riding trains and horses, all while Edwin was severely ill, like it wasn't clear if he would live through the journey. Plus, his whole family couldn't just go with him, it would basically be Edwin and maybe his wife. And so after explaining this experimental protocol, Dr. Metcalf went quiet and just watched the Browns as they considered what he had just said. And it was obvious the entire family was very upset and didn't know what to make of this, but at the same time, they knew they had no other choice. And so as the sisters kind of held back tears and whispered amongst each other, and as George looked up at the doctor not sure what to say, finally Edwin, from the bed, croaked out the first words he'd said that day. He said that yes, he and his wife would go to Colorado. Three years later, in January of 1892, Edwin held his wife's hand as they walked through the snow in the Rocky Mountains. The high elevation and dry air in Colorado Springs had worked like a charm. Edwin was back to feeling like his normal self again. After walking a bit longer, Edwin told his wife they should head back home for lunch. When they got to their house, Edwin's wife rushed inside out of the cold, but Edwin stayed for a second and checked the mailbox for any letters from his dad and sisters. And he found there was an envelope, so he opened it and he unfolded the note inside. It was a handwritten letter from his father, and as Edwin scanned the paper, his face fell. The note said that one of Edwin's little sisters, 19-year-old Mercy, had unfortunately passed away. Edwin knew that Mercy had been sick. She'd contracted the White Death almost a year earlier. He had tried to convince her to move out to Colorado with him and his wife because he knew that would cure this, but Mercy said she didn't think she could make the long journey, and she didn't want to leave behind her sisters, and so she had stayed. But now, Mercy was gone, and so Edwin knew he would need to head back to Rhode Island and be there to grieve with his family. A few weeks later, back in Rhode Island, Edwin and his father braced themselves against the harsh winter cold in Exeter, and together, they silently dug rocks out of the frozen ground. They were trying to prepare the field for planting in the spring. It was hard work, but the physical labor was actually a welcome distraction from their grief. Edwin pushed a sharp shovel into the ground, and as he wedged another rock out of the soil, he suddenly felt like a heavy weight was pressing down on his chest. He dropped his shovel and started coughing so hard that it stung his throat. He put a hand over his mouth to block the cough, and when he caught his breath and moved his hand away, he saw that his palm was now speckled with blood. When he looked up, Edwin saw his father staring at him with a horrified expression. They both knew what this meant. Now that he was back in Rhode Island, Edwin's case of the White Death had returned. In March, about a month later, George woke in the night to the sound of his only son coughing violently. George jumped out of bed and rushed to the kitchen to grab a cup of water, and then made his way into Edwin's room, which was dimly lit by an oil lamp. Edwin had become so sick after contracting the White Death that he couldn't go anywhere, and he had been bedridden for the last 2 weeks here in Rhode Island. It was like all the progress he'd made living in Colorado had now been undone, and he was now sicker than he'd been before. He looked frail and gray, and George could see spots on the white bedsheet from where Edwin had been coughing up blood. George held out the cup of water for his son, and Edwin grabbed the glass with shaky hands and drank it in between coughs. Then Edwin looked at his father, and in a hoarse and frightened voice, he said something that terrified George. He said, "She was here. She haunts me." George just stared at his son. He had no idea what his son was talking about, but before George could ask, Edwin was gripped by another coughing fit, and the only thing George could think to do was send for Dr. Metcalf. Less than an hour later, George stood by Edwin's bedside as Dr. Metcalf examined his son. Now, George knew his son was in very bad shape at this point, but he was still shocked when Dr. Metcalf, after examining Edwin, turned to George and just said, "It's in God's hands now." There was apparently nothing he or anyone else could do to help Edwin. George was beyond devastated. He had lost his wife, 2 daughters, and now he was just counting the days until his only son passed away too. He felt totally powerless. But Edwin, despite hearing this grave news, was putting on a brave face. With his voice still hoarse from coughing, he asked his father if he had any whiskey. If his days were indeed numbered, well, they might as well enjoy the last few moments. George nodded and headed to the kitchen, and as he was taking glasses out of the cabinet for the whiskey, he heard a knock at the door, which was odd because it was well past midnight and he never had visitors this late. George set the glasses down, made his way to the door, and opened it up to see 6 of his neighbors standing there on the porch. One of them, an older woman with graying hair, said they'd heard that his son Edwin was sick, and a few of them had seen Dr. Metcalf come over earlier, and so they were concerned. But they said they were not just here to pay their condolences. They were here to try to save him. George had to stop himself from letting out a very bitter laugh. He already knew no one could help his son. No one had been able to help anybody else in his family when they had the White Death, and it was just a matter of time before his son died. But he let the neighbors inside anyway, if only because seeing a few familiar faces might lift his son's spirits. When George and the visitors rounded the corner into Edwin's room, most of the neighbors went to Edwin's bedside to say hello, but the older woman walked directly towards Dr. Metcalf and began speaking to him in a very hushed voice. George was curious, so he walked closer to listen, and he heard this woman tell Dr. Metcalf that she actually knew how to cure Edwin. The doctor told her that was not possible. Nobody could cure this sickness. But the woman said Edwin was not sick. He was actually cursed by a vampire. George watched Dr. Metcalf's face go red with anger. He told the woman that she was being absolutely ridiculous. The doctor then looked over at George like he wanted somebody to back him up here, but George was desperate enough to consider anything at this point, and as crazy as a vampire's curse sounded, he didn't think it was that far-fetched, and so he wanted to hear more from this woman. After all, the White Death had made his loved ones look like the life was being sucked out of them, almost like a vampire was draining their blood. And just earlier that night, Edwin had said something to George that totally caught him off guard when he said, "She was here. She haunts me." And so George wondered if maybe his son was referencing this vampire. And so George turned from the doctor to his son and asked him about what he had said earlier about somebody being in the room with him, somebody haunting him. And Edwin croaked out that earlier, when he was alone in the room, he had seen this woman standing in the corner of his bedroom, staring at him with cold, dead eyes. Now, he said he didn't know if this had been a dream or not, but it had felt so real that now he was scared to death from the experience. To George, his son's testimony only seemed to strengthen the neighbor's vampire theory. However, George told the older woman that he wanted proof that this really is what was going on, that a vampire was behind what was happening to his family. And so the older woman called over another one of the neighbors, a farmer that George sometimes shared crops with, and he told George and Dr. Metcalf that he'd seen cases like this before. He explained that sometimes when a person died, a dark supernatural force would take over their body and cause them to leech the life out of their surviving loved ones, even from beyond the grave. These people were not really dead, the farmer said. They were vampires. At this point, the older woman interrupted the farmer and said to figure out which one of George's deceased family members was the vampire, all they had to do was exhume the bodies of his wife and 2 daughters. If one of the women's bodies hadn't yet decomposed, or if her heart still contained blood, that was a telltale sign that she was the vampire. To George, this whole process sounded barbaric, and he couldn't bear the thought of seeing his wife and children's decomposing bodies. But for all he knew, his neighbors could be right, and this could be his only chance to save his only son. So George gave the neighbors his blessing to go dig up his family members' bodies, and then George turned to Dr. Metcalf and, said he couldn't go and see this, and so asked the doctor to please go to the graveyard on his behalf. That way the doctor could be his eyes and also be the voice of reason. A few minutes later, Dr. Metcalf trudged through the dirt, lagging behind the neighbors, as they made their way toward the Chestnut Hill Cemetery. Between the 7 of them, they had 3 small lanterns, one of which Dr. Metcalf was holding to light his way. As the doctor walked along, he could hear the neighbors up ahead of him whispering about this vampire and what they were going to do, and it was hard for the doctor not to feel totally annoyed, because he did not believe a curse was behind what was happening to George's family. But he reminded himself that George was utterly desperate and had really kind of convinced himself that maybe this curse really was the thing, and Dr. Metcalf didn't have the heart to just completely shoot it down. And so if this is what it took, going along with the neighbors to the graveyard to prove that George's son Edwin was not suffering from some kind of ridiculous curse, then ultimately this was worth it. Eventually, the neighbors and the doctor reached the cemetery's iron gates, which creaked as the farmer pushed them open. To the right of the entrance, Dr. Metcalf could see a stone crypt, and next to it, he could see the Brown family's plot. And it didn't take long for the group to locate the tombstones they were looking for. Dr. Metcalf stood a few feet away and watched while 2 of the neighbors held up lanterns and 3 others stuck shovels into George's wife's grave. They threw dirt to the side until eventually they unearthed her wooden coffin. The leader of the neighbors, the older woman who brought up the vampire curse, unlatched the casket, pulled it open, and revealed the dusty skeleton of George's late wife. She'd been dead for 9 years, and so her body had, like Dr. Metcalf had expected, totally decomposed. To the neighbors, though, this only meant that George's wife was not the vampire, but one of the 2 daughters was. So they reburied the wife and dug up George's first daughter, the one who had died just a few months after George's wife. And again, when they opened up the coffin, it was just full of bones, and so they reburied the daughter as well. And then finally, the neighbors exhumed Mercy, the second daughter, who had died just 8 weeks earlier. And what they found inside of her casket struck even Dr. Metcalf, the most skeptical person there, as absolutely inexplicable. Despite having been dead for 2 full months by this point, Mercy's body had not even begun to decompose. And to make things even stranger, Mercy's body was lying on its side, as if she had literally turned over in her grave after being buried. The gray-haired woman turned to Dr. Metcalf and pointed and said, "Look, there's your vampire." The doctor, who was admittedly kind of shaken up, still insisted there had to be some kind of rational medical explanation for this, but the neighbors wouldn't listen. They had already begun performing a ritual that they believed would kill the vampire, break the curse, and save Edwin's life. The neighbors gathered up twigs and arranged them on top of a nearby boulder. Then the farmer flicked a match and kindled the flame into a small bonfire. And then Dr. Metcalf watched in stunned silence as the older woman pulled something out of a bag that she'd carried into the cemetery. And in the flickering light, he saw a flash of silver, and he realized what the woman had pulled from her bag was a huge kitchen knife. And then Dr. Metcalf looked on in horror as the woman stuck that blade directly into Mercy's abdomen, slicing her stomach open, and then the woman reached up under Mercy's ribs and pulled out her liver and her heart. And then after opening them up, both organs were indeed still full of coagulated blood, as though Mercy's body had been using these organs recently. At this point, the old woman placed Mercy's organs on top of the fire and let them burn down to ash. But after that, the ritual was not done. The older woman pulled something else out of her bag. It was a jar full of water, and she unscrewed the cap. Then she scooped the ashes of the organs and put them into this water, then closed the jar and shook up the contents. The woman said the ritual was almost complete. All they needed to do now was have Edwin drink this entire concoction of water and his sister's burned organs. The neighbors turned and began marching out of the cemetery, and Dr. Metcalf, who was still just shocked by everything he had just seen, kind of chased after them, begging them to stop, but none of them even looked back. They were on a mission. A little while later that evening, Edwin was propped up in bed, feeling lifeless and miserable, surrounded by his father, Dr. Metcalf, and the group of neighbors. Edwin held the jar of black liquid in his hands, but he hadn't drunk any of it yet. Instead, he listened as Dr. Metcalf and the older woman argued. Dr. Metcalf said that if Edwin drank that, it would only make him sicker. But the older woman insisted it was the only medicine that would cure him. Edwin looked to his father for some advice about what to do, but George told Edwin it was up to him. Staring at the watery ashes of his own sister's heart and liver, Edwin almost began to gag. He couldn't decide what to do. If he drank this vile liquid, he could die, but if he didn't drink it, he would still very likely die. So he ultimately decided he had nothing to lose. He unscrewed the jar's cap, brought the black water to his lips, and began to drink. But despite drinking his sister's burned liver and heart, 2 months after this ritual, Edwin still died of the White Death. The ritual had not worked. And after losing his only son, George Brown's life continued to get worse. Over the next 6 years, 3 more of his daughters would die of the White Death, leaving him with only one child, his daughter Hattie. George lived another 2 decades. However, his one remaining child, Hattie, would outlive George by about another 40 years. She would die in 1954, but she lived long enough to actually see a cure developed for the White Death, because it would turn out the White Death was not some curse caused by a vampire. It was actually a very common and very deadly infectious disease called tuberculosis, and by 1954, a vaccine had been developed. But back in the late 1800s, tuberculosis was a global epidemic. It was highly infectious, often spreading amongst families or other tight-knit social groups, and it accounted for 25% of all deaths in the northeastern United States, where the Brown family lived. But despite how common it was, tuberculosis was very poorly understood. There were many different types, and the symptoms could vary widely, so it wasn't always accurately diagnosed. And even when it was, there was no effective medications, so treatment was mostly guesswork. Although almost everyone in New England at the time knew someone who had died of tuberculosis, the Brown family had a uniquely horrible experience. They lived in an isolated, half-abandoned community where superstition reigned. So when they started coming down with the so-called White Death, which was a nickname for tuberculosis, their neighbors thought they'd become the victim of a vampire, and when they exhumed Mercy and found that her body had not decomposed, they took that as proof that she possessed supernatural powers and was behind the curse. But just like Dr. Metcalf suspected on the night where they exhumed her, there actually was You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. Although almost everyone in New England at the time knew someone who had died of tuberculosis, the Brown family had a uniquely horrible experience. They lived in an isolated, half-abandoned community where superstition reigned. So when they started coming down with the so-called White Death, which was a nickname for tuberculosis, their neighbors thought they'd become the victim of a vampire, and when they exhumed Although almost everyone in New England at the time knew someone who had died of tuberculosis, the Brown family had a uniquely horrible experience. They lived in an isolated, half-abandoned community where superstition reigned. So when they started coming down with the so-called White Death, which was a nickname for tuberculosis, their neighbors thought they'd become the victim of a vampire, and when they exhumed Mercy and found that her body had not decomposed, they took that as proof that she possessed supernatural powers and was behind the curse. But just like Dr. Metcalf suspected on the night where they exhumed her, there actually was a rational explanation for why Mercy's body had not decomposed. Mercy died in the middle of the harsh New England winter, when the ground was so frozen that it would have been impossible to actually dig a grave. So instead of being buried underground in the cemetery next to her mother and sister, she was still buried in the cemetery, but above ground in that stone crypt, where her body was naturally frozen and preserved. As for why her body appeared to have rolled over inside of her coffin, that was most likely because the neighbors had moved the casket as they opened it and sort of accidentally shifted her remains. However, Mercy's reputation as a vampire lived on, and her story made headlines all across the country, and in fact, in 1896, one article about Mercy the Vampire made it into the hands of an aspiring novelist named Bram Stoker. He would release Dracula 1 year later, and the book featured a young woman who was turned into a vampire and later had her body exhumed. The character's name was Lucy, a combination of Mercy and her middle name, which was Lena. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we do sometimes use aliases because we don't know the names of the real people involved. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said in these stories, but everything is based on research. And also a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Karis Allen Pash Cooper. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Andre Plus. Our coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Samantha Collins. Production support by Avery Siegel. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and also Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis for Wondery. You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. Today's podcast will feature 2 spooky stories about messages from beyond. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Wrong Path Home, and it's about a news report with a frightening secret message. The second and final story you'll hear is called Mother Knows Best, and it's about one of the very few credible paranormal encounters in American history. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the follow button a tuna sandwich, but instead of using tuna made for people, go ahead and use a can of cat food. Okay, let's get into our first story called Wrong Path Home. At around 9 p.m. on October 26, 2009, a 19-year-old college student named Miyako Hiroka bagged up the last bit of trash inside of the ice cream parlor where she worked, and she dumped it into a bag and she tied that bag up. It was closing time, and so Miyako looked around the inside of the parlor, made sure everything was where it was supposed to be, and then she flipped off the lights, threw her purse over her shoulder, she grabbed that bag of trash, she headed outside the parlor, she shut and locked the door, she dumped the trash in a nearby bin, and then began walking towards the exit of the mall, which is where this parlor was located. It was inside of this big mall. Miyako went to school in a city called Hamada City, which is located on the coast of Japan in an area called the Shimane Prefecture. And Hamada City was a totally beautiful and very remote location with these amazing beaches and unbelievable mountains with all these ski resorts on it. I mean, this was an incredible place to live. But as much as Miyako did love living there, she was actually far more excited about where she'd be living the next year because she was doing an exchange program. She'd be studying in Russia, and that was so exciting for her. And in fact, this exchange program was the reason why Miyako had picked up this job at this ice cream parlor, because she came from a family that was not poor by any means, but they didn't have a lot of extra income, and Miyako felt strongly that she really wanted to pay her way to go do this big Russian exchange program because it wasn't cheap, and so she was picking up as many shifts as she could to save up money to pay her way. And so Miyako eventually reached the exit of this mall, and she stepped outside into the night, and then she had a decision she needed to make. And she needed to make this decision every night after work. There were 2 ways that she could get back to her dorm, which was located about a mile away. The quick way would be to just hop on a bus and have the bus take her to her dorm, but that cost money, and remember, Miyako is trying to save up as much money as she can to pay for Russia next year, and so taking the bus just felt like, not really worth it.
And the other option, which was free, was much longer and frankly just plain spooky. And Miyako hated it. What it entailed was basically just walking to her dorm, but it would mean walking for about a third of a mile through this really spooky forest that looked like it was straight out of a horror movie. Now, up until recently, Miyako's coworker had always left with her at the same time, and they lived roughly in the same area, and so they would walk together through that forest, saving money, and also, providing each other security as they went through the spooky area. But recently, the coworker had quit, and so now Miyako was all alone. And so as Miyako stood there wondering what she should do, take the bus route or take the forest route, she just thought about, next year, it's all going to be worth it. I'm going to go to Russia. I'm going to pay my way. It's going to be awesome. And after all, what's the worst that can happen? It's just a few minutes walking through a forest I've done dozens of times. Before long, I'll be in my brightly lit, safe dorm room studying away, and everything will be fine. And so Miyako turned and began walking towards the forest. The following day, a little past 4 p.m., the owner of the ice cream shop where Miyako worked was standing inside the parlor feeling really annoyed because Miyako had not shown up for her shift, and now the owner, who normally did a lot of administrative and managerial things, was stuck at the counter serving all the customers, basically doing Miyako's job. But when 5 p.m. came and still Miyako had not shown up, and the owner had tried calling her and she didn't pick up, and there was just no sign of her, the owner went from being annoyed to being somewhat worried. And so after again not being able to call Miyako to figure out what was going on, he wound up going through her file and finding her mother's phone number, and he called her. And when he spoke to Miyako's mother, he knew right away there was something wrong. Because Miyako's mother actually was pretty panicked, and she said, you know what? Last night when Miyako was coming home from work, she told me she would call me when she got to her dorm, but I never heard from her, and I haven't been able to get in touch with her since. And so after this conversation ended, Miyako's mother would call the police and report her daughter missing. And pretty much instantly, the police in Hamada City responded in force. I mean, they launched a huge investigation to go figure out what happened to Miyako. And really the reason behind that is because Hamada City is this unbelievable place, this secluded, safe place where things like this did not happen. And frankly, it scared everybody, and they wanted to deal with it as quickly as possible. And so what police did at first is they went and looked at security footage from the ice cream parlor where they knew she had been working on the night she went missing. And sure enough, at about 9:16 p.m., there's footage of her walking out of the ice cream parlor in the mall. She's got a purse over her shoulder and, she shuts and locks the door. She throws the trash away, and then she heads towards the exit. But after that, nobody saw her. There was no more footage. There was no more tips or anything. She just vanished once she left the mall. And so very quickly, this story gained lots of attention because, again, Hamada City is like this quintessential vacation spot. It's so perfect. It's so safe. And to have this girl just go missing, it was scandalous. And so it made the news all over Hamada City. And also people who lived in Hamada City were suddenly on edge at night. What's out there snatching people up? In fact, Miyako's college, during the few days following her disappearance, they set a curfew for all their students. Like, all their students had to be back in their dorms at a certain time to keep them safe. But again, despite the police really leaning into this case from the jump and putting all their manpower and all their resources into this, they really had no idea what happened to Miyako. Then, on November 6th, 2009, so 11 days after Miyako went missing, a man who was hunting for mushrooms up on this mountainside about 15 miles away from the ice cream parlor believed he spotted this beautiful mushroom sitting underneath a few fallen leaves. And so excited, the guy runs over and he begins moving away the leaves to grab this big meaty mushroom. But as soon as he grabbed the skin of this mushroom and began to pull, he stopped. And then he quickly turned and began sprinting back down the path that had brought him up here. And as he was running, he pulled his phone out and he saw he had no service, and he just kept on running and holding the phone up looking for service. And then finally, when he was about halfway down the mountain, he saw he had service in his phone and he called the police. And the second the dispatcher answered, this man began screaming, "I found a human head." When police arrived on that mountainside where this man claimed to have found a human head, well, they confirmed he was right. They found Miyako's severed head right underneath those leaves. And the reason this guy thought her head was a mushroom, a dark colored mushroom, because it was obvious that Miyako's face had been so badly beaten and it was all black and blue before she lost her head. And so this mushroom hunter had literally thought that was a big, big mushroom. And so at this point, the Hamada City Police shifted their area of search from around the mall and the ice cream parlor where they thought they would find Miyako to this forested mountain area where her head was found. And now, of course, it was no longer a search and rescue, it was a recovery mission. They're just looking for the rest of Miyako's body. And over the next couple of days, as police searched this forested mountainside, they would find different parts of Miyako all over the place. And then after they had found, all the pieces to Miyako, the running theory based on what they were seeing is that very likely she had been strangled to death and then her body was burned and then she was dismembered and scattered throughout this forested mountain area. But there was very little evidence about who had actually done this to Miyako. Miyako had no enemies to
Y'all
speak
see
of.
that? Y'all
Everybody
see
who
that?
spoke about Miyako said she was incredibly lovely and kind, and really there wasn't
see.
anybody in her life that would want
I
to do her
cannot see
harm.
with that
And
energy
also
in the
because
middle.
Miyako's body had been destroyed and left out for so long, any trace evidence left behind by her killer or killers was basically non-existent. And so the police really had no leads to speak of.
Let me pause this. Oh God, I cannot see. Let me show you. Usually I play this game on my phone and I'm really good, but the energy is not in the middle like that. So it's like blocking what I can see because usually I can go all the way down until the black like that. But not being able to see because the energy is in the way is stopping me. Let's see. Yeah, because you saw the 15. I usually get like two something. But if I'm trying to make a goal, I have to slow down because I can't see. Now I'm just gonna F with it. I'm gonna see if I can um just maneuver myself into being able to do it without being able to see clearly. I'll put the podcast back on in a minute. I just want to see if I can wing this because I'm trying to make a goal. I'm not trying to be on here super long. I'm not trying to keep starting over. My highest score is was 300,000. So I'm going to see if I can get that. I thought I would be able to get 100,000 like before the podcast ends because usually that's what happens, but being on the laptop is different. Okay, I think I got the hang of it. Yeah, I'm just going to wing it. All right, let me put back on the podcast. Thanks for hanging with me, whoever you are. Much appreciated. See, now look at that. Mm, I guess we're starting at 0 again. I don't know if I like this podcast that's playing now, but I want to know what happened, so let's just finish it up.
They had no suspects or anything, and so they called in psychologists to try to make, a profile of who they thought might have done this. And the best theory anyone could come up with was that this had been a random crime of opportunity, that the person who killed her didn't know her, and that likely her killer was a man who was likely between the ages of 20 and 40. But even that information really didn't narrow anything down, and so quickly, this case began to go cold. But as the police investigation itself began to go cold, the kind of lore around this story was only growing. I mean, this really seemed like a totally unbelievable case, considering where it happened. I mean, Hamada City is like this perfect place. How could this happen here? And so what started as being kind of a local news story, albeit a big local news story, became a major national story all over Japan. And so all these TV outlets and journalists were descending on Hamada City, and they were taking video of the ice cream parlor and of the police department and filming, Miyako's dorm and her school and her parents' house. I mean, there were people all over the place trying to get any bit of information to report on about this case. And despite there being dozens and dozens of these live reports basically every day coming out of Hamada City about this case and about Miyako, there was one particular news report that took this case from being, totally unfortunate and sad and tragic and horrible to completely unbelievable and bizarre. Shortly after Miyako's remains had basically all been found, but they were still doing some recovery operations up on that mountainside, one of these kind of random TV reporters who was in Hamada City to report on this crazy case decided to set up their TV camera so it was pointing towards the dark entrance of that spooky forest that Miyako would walk through to get back to her dorm. And so this TV news reporter's got their microphone and, they're standing with the forest entrance right behind them, and the cameraman's filming, looking towards this opening of the forest. And the actual report was pretty generic. I mean, this reporter was basically saying, well, coming at you live from Hamada City, just outside of the forest where perhaps Miyako was killed. And it was just like that. It was just kind of talking about the case, and there was nothing to it. At least not to the TV reporter and the cameraman who were on site. Because for them, the entire report was pretty routine. They did their job, they got their shot, they got their report, and then they left. But they streamed it live. So while they were doing it, all these people are tuned in watching this news report live in front of this forest. And something really unsettling happened on this broadcast. While that news reporter was talking, another voice began to be heard by people watching this broadcast. And it was not the cameraman, and it was certainly not the TV journalist. It was a woman's voice. And there was no woman anywhere near the shot. And after the fact, the journalist and the cameraman would also attest that there was nobody around. It was just them. But this detached, very pained voice said very clearly, and all these people heard it live, "This is very painful. Why only me?" And so after this news report happened, this story, this case about Miyako, went from being just a Japanese story to being like an international sensation, because everybody believed when they saw this video that that voice that was heard was Miyako's ghost, basically talking on camera. That's why you can't see her. It's her spirit communicating with the living world. However, despite that drawing even more attention to this case, it didn't remotely help the police actually solve the case. They still had no idea who did this. And that's how this case would stay for years, just totally stalled. That is until 7 years later, when a police officer was conducting a routine police review of old criminal case files that hadn't been solved, going through them all to see if maybe evidence had been missed, and maybe that was why the case had not been solved. And so this police officer is looking through all these case files, and when they landed on the Miyako case, they did discover a piece of evidence that had been totally overlooked. It was the file of a convicted sex offender named Yoshiharu Yano. Yoshiharu was a 33-year-old man who had served time in prison for assaults on 3 different women in Tokyo, which is 500 miles away from Yamada City, where Miyako was killed. And because of that 500-mile gap between Tokyo and Hamada City, Yoshiharu had been completely overlooked in terms of being a suspect in Miyako's murder. It just seemed like he was too far away to be involved. But the police officer who was doing that routine review, they discovered that right before Miyako was murdered, this Yoshiharu guy had been let out of prison and decided to live in Hamada City. And on the night Miyako was killed, when she decided to walk into that forest, well, they found security footage of Yoshiharu's car driving along around that forest and up near that mountain where Miyako's remains were all discovered. And so this investigator who discovered this piece of information got permission from higher-ups to search Yoshiharu's home where he was living right then. And when they searched his home, they discovered a digital camera with 40 photos on it that would explain what happened to Miyako. It was very clear Yoshiharu had murdered Miyako because some of the pictures contain photos of Miyako and they are just horrible. But figuring out who Miyako's killer was not the end of this case. In fact, it wasn't even the most shocking part of this case. The most shocking part of this case is what happened to Miyako's killer, Yoshiharu, basically right after she was murdered, and that voice, that detached female voice, was heard on that TV news report. 7 years earlier, right around the time that Miyako's head had been found, and also after that voice had been heard on the TV newscast, some people who were driving in a car north of Hamada City began calling the police to report something very strange. They called the police and said, there is this small white Toyota Corolla car that has 2 people inside of it, and they've driven to the side of the road, and the driver is ramming over and over again against the railing. Like they're smashing into the railing,
God.
smashing over and over again, like the car is somehow in control. They don't understand how these people are not getting out of the car. Like, what are they doing? Traffic had stopped on either side. It was just totally nonsensical. And then by the time the police showed up, this car that was just repeatedly driving into the side of this guardrail, it burst into flames with the 2 people inside still clearly alive and looking terrified, and they caught on fire and died. Now, at the time, this did make the news. It looked very much like some sort of weird murder-suicide where the driver had intentionally, driven the car until it burst into flames and killed themselves and also their passenger. But it didn't really amount to more than just a really weird news story because there was no connection to the Miyako case. This is like a totally isolated thing. However, 7 years later, when that police officer discovered the link that Yoshiharu was in Hamada City, and then they figured out, yep, Yoshiharu was the killer, well, suddenly, that totally weird murder-suicide took on a whole new meaning. Because the driver of that car was Yoshiharu, and the passenger was his mother. And again, from eyewitness testimony, it didn't really make sense the way this all happened. It was almost like the car was possessed or something, that, the passengers couldn't control it. Now, who knows if that's true, but when you combine it with the sound of that female voice on the TV news camera that everybody assumed was Miyako's ghost saying, "This is so painful, why only me?" suddenly those words took on a new meaning. People thought, you know what it is? Miyako's ghost must have taken control of that car and made sure not only Yoshiharu suffered and died, but his family member died as well, that she was seeking her revenge on her killer.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Mother Knows Best.
In the early evening of January 23rd, 1897, a blacksmith named Erasmus Shue stoked his fire inside of his little shop in rural West Virginia and then called out to his 11-year-old helper who was in the back cleaning up. Erasmus had been planning to head home early that night. However, a last-minute order for horseshoes had just come in, and so Erasmus knew that was not going to happen. He was going to have to work late. And so he was calling for his helper to send the helper to his home, Erasmus's home, to check on Erasmus's wife, Zona. He wanted to make sure that 1, Zona knew he would be late, and 2, if Zona needed anything, the helper could go out and get it for her or help around the house or whatever she needed. After the helper had left, Erasmus went back to poking at his fire, but his mind was not on the horseshoes he needed to make. Instead, it was on his wife, Zona. The couple hadn't told anyone yet, but Zona was pregnant. Erasmus and Zona had only just met a couple of months earlier, but they had fallen in love very quickly. Zona was 23 years old, and she had beautiful dark hair and dark eyes and a quick sense of humor. She was a total free spirit who had grown up on a farm, and she had never really been away from home. When Erasmus had arrived in the little village called Livesey's Mill, which was located near a river at the foot of this mountain and was right near where Zona lived, he and Zona had noticed each other right away. Erasmus, who was quite a bit older than Zona, he was 35 years old, was tall and handsome with piercing blue eyes, and he had come to this little rural town to set up his blacksmith shop. And to Zona, he was like this amazing, new, exciting thing. Zona's family, especially her mother, Mary Jane, did not approve of the fact that Zona and Erasmus had begun seeing each other, mostly because Mary Jane didn't like the fact that Erasmus was so much older than Zona, but Zona was known for being incredibly stubborn, and she loved Erasmus, and so there was just no stopping her. So, in November, just a couple of months after meeting each other, Zona and Erasmus got married and they moved into a little house together, and very quickly, Zona got pregnant. And both she and Erasmus were so excited about this that they wanted to go around and tell people, but early on, it was clear Zona had some complications with this pregnancy. She was sick all the time, and she just seemed really unwell, and the doctor who was seeing her knew that it likely had to do with her pregnancy. And so the couple decided that they should just wait and let the pregnancy develop a bit before announcing the news. So, on this late January day, Erasmus began hustling to finish these horseshoes because he really wanted to get home and be there for Zona and make sure she really was okay. And so as Erasmus thought about Zona, the steel he was heating inside of this fire was glowing bright orange and was ready to be forged into shape. And so Erasmus got his hammer and he got to work. Meanwhile, Erasmus's 11-year-old helper had arrived at Erasmus and Zona's house, and the helper walked through the gate up to the front door of this little 2-story home, and he knocked on the front door. But Zona did not come to the door, which the helper thought was odd, because Zona was someone who was always bustling around the home and was very quick to open the door and chat with neighbors. And now, standing in front of this door, the helper couldn't even hear a sound inside of the house. It was like no one was home. And so the helper knocked again, and after some more silence, he just reached down and tried the doorknob and found it was unlocked, and so he swung the door in. And right away, the helper noticed that the house was totally dark. None of the lamps were lit, even though the sun was setting fast. And so the helper stepped inside of the house and continued to call out for Mrs. Shu, but there was no answer. And at some point, as the helper turned a corner and looked towards the base of the stairs that led up to the second level, he froze, because lying on the ground was Zona. She was lying perpendicular to how the stairs run, on her back with one arm over her chest, like she was sleeping at the foot of the stairs. And so at this point, the helper is scared. He doesn't know what's going on here. Obviously something is wrong. And so very slowly, the helper began moving closer and closer to Zona. And when he was practically right on top of her, he yelled out her name one more time. And when she didn't call back and her chest wasn't moving and she was just totally still, he knew obviously something was terribly wrong. And so the helper at this point turned around and sprinted out of the house and ran back to his own house. And when he got there, he ran inside and he told his mother that he thought Mrs. Shu, Zona, was dead. And so the mother told the helper, run back to the blacksmith shop and tell Erasmus to go home right now. I'll get the doctor. It would take the local doctor, the same one who had been treating Zona for her pregnancy complications, almost an hour to finally get to Zona's house. And when the doctor arrived, he found the 11-year-old helper and his mother and other neighbors kind of clustered around in the first floor of the home. And then when he went up to the second floor into the master bedroom, he found Erasmus, who by this point had returned, and he was sitting on his bed, and he had laid out his wife, Zona, so that she was on her back and her head was in his arms, and he was stroking her hair and rocking back and forth and crying. The doctor, of course, knew Zona and Erasmus very well because of how often he had been treating Zona for her pregnancy issues over these last few weeks, and so he felt a pit of sadness looking at this scene, but he knew he had to do his job, and so he gently walked over and he put his hand on Erasmus's shoulder, and he just said, I need to examine Zona's body. And Erasmus, at this point, he didn't even look up. He just continued to sob and rock back and forth while stroking her hair. Finally, the doctor kind of was a bit more forceful in asking Erasmus to step aside, at which point Erasmus did. He got out of the way and positioned Zona flat on the bed, and he made sure her hair was perfectly combed all around her neck. And then Erasmus knelt down right next to the bed and continued stroking his wife's hair and crying, while the doctor at this point kind of moved to the foot of the bed and began looking at Zona and beginning his examination. And the doctor would quickly confirm that yes, Zona was dead, and after looking at her pelvis and kind of moving her around, the doctor came to the conclusion that very likely Zona had passed away from pregnancy complications. Zona's funeral would be held the next day at the local cemetery at the top of this hilltop, and by this point, the word had gotten out that Zona had been pregnant when she died. And so during this funeral, everybody was staring at Erasmus, who was overcome with grief and crying so hard that he could barely catch his breath. And then right before they lowered Zona's casket into the ground, Erasmus made a point of putting his wife's favorite scarf into the coffin with her. He said his final goodbyes, he shut the casket, and then it was lowered into the ground. But while the mourners were obviously very moved by just how unbelievably grief-stricken Erasmus was, his whole family was wiped out in one blow, what really stood out to the people that attended that funeral was not Erasmus's reaction to his wife's death, but rather Zona's mother's reaction to Erasmus. During this funeral, Mary Jane, Zona's mother, didn't seem sad or grief-stricken or in any way reacting to the fact that her daughter had died. Instead, as the funeral went on, Mary Jane shamelessly glared at Erasmus with a look of pure hate and disgust on her face. And then, after the funeral was over, all the mourners wanted to go up to Mary Jane and Erasmus to pay their final respects to the family, but Mary Jane ignored all these people and promptly left the funeral without saying a word to anyone. And in the days that followed Zona's funeral, Mary Jane's behavior only continued to get more and more bizarre. When neighbors would drop by Mary Jane's house to drop off food or just check in on her, Mary Jane refused to come to the door. Mary Jane basically began staying up all night. People would see there were candles lit in her bedroom at all hours, and they'd see her pacing around her room and then periodically kneeling on the ground and kind of staring off into the distance. And then on the rare occasion that Mary Jane actually left her house, she would look totally disheveled and distracted, and as she walked around town, she'd be mumbling under her breath and constantly looking over her shoulder like she was scared someone was following her. And when concerned neighbors came up to Mary when she was out of her house, she refused to make eye contact with them, didn't want to talk to them, and as fast as she could would get away from them. Whatever was going on with Mary Jane, her husband was not willing to talk about it to other people in town. However, they did notice that he had begun sleeping in the barn, so he was not even staying in the house with his wife. And then, on the morning of February 21st, so about a month after Zona had died, Mary Jane walked out of her house looking totally clean-cut. She was not disheveled. She was not looking over her shoulder. She wasn't muttering to herself. She was standing tall, moving with a purpose, looking totally coherent. And as she moved, the only emotion people could see on her face was anger. And so Mary Jane, angrily, walking with a purpose, walked her way to the local prosecutor's office. And instead of knocking and waiting to be let inside, she just opened the door and barged right inside. The prosecutor knew Mary Jane and knew how strange she had been acting over these last few weeks, and so when she came inside, he was alarmed at her sudden presence, but he was also pretty curious as to what was going on. And so when she came in and demanded to speak to him, he was happy to go into his office and take a meeting kind of simply out of curiosity. But once the two of them sat down in his office, Mary Jane proceeded to tell this prosecutor this totally outlandish story about her dead daughter, Zona, that at first made the prosecutor think, okay, clearly Mary Jane has lost her mind. That's what's been going on over the past few weeks. All this grief of losing her daughter has caused her to kind of snap. But by the end of these 2 hours that Mary Jane seemed to just be kind of rambling about this story about her daughter, the prosecutor started to realize that what she was saying kind of made a lot of sense, and his suspicions began to rise and rise. And so once Mary Jane was done telling this wild story about Zona, the prosecutor was convinced that what Mary Jane was saying had to be true, and so he knew they needed to dig Zona up. And so after Mary Jane had left, the prosecutor ran to the local doctor's house, the same doctor who had been treating Zona and then also looked at her after she died. And the prosecutor would tell the doctor that, hey, we need to exhume Zona and you need to examine her again. And the doctor at first was like, wait a minute, what's going on here? But then after hearing what the prosecutor had to say about this crazy story that Mary Jane had just told him, the doctor agreed that, okay, yeah, we do need to do this. And so the next day, February 22nd, a team of men with shovels, along with the prosecutor and the doctor, headed up to the Hilltop Cemetery where Zona was buried, and they dug her casket up, and then they carried the casket down to the local schoolhouse, and then once she was inside, the workers lifted her body, which was fairly well preserved because the ground was so cold. They lifted her body out and they placed it on a table, and then everybody left except for the doctor and the prosecutor. And once the room was clear, the doctor and the prosecutor began examining Zona all over again. And within about 30 seconds of this re-examination of Zona's body, basically at the exact same time, the doctor and the prosecutor, who were on either sides of the body, saw the thing that Mary Jane had alluded to in her wild story about her daughter. And so the doctor and the prosecutor, they're seeing this thing, they look up at each other and they can't believe it. Mary Jane's story had to be true. The following is Mary Jane's wild story. On the day of Zona's funeral, even though Mary Jane was overcome with grief over losing her daughter, the feeling that she really was harboring was hatred towards Erasmus. She hated Erasmus, she had always hated him, but now it was like her daughter is dead and she's forced to watch this guy sob and cry over her daughter's casket, when in her mind she's like, this funeral is about her, it's not about you. And so the whole funeral, she's just staring at Erasmus, channeling all of her energy towards hating him. But then, as she's doing this, a new emotion began to creep up on her that she couldn't quite describe. Basically, it felt like something was terribly wrong. And intuitively, Mary Jane felt like the only person who could explain what this thing was that was wrong kind of in her life somewhere was her daughter, Zona, who was obviously dead. And so this feeling that something is terribly wrong, it completely consumed Mary Jane's mind. And so by the end of the funeral, she wasn't mad at Erasmus. She was just thinking, how do I get in touch with my daughter? I need to get answers from my daughter. And so when the funeral ended, Mary Jane just left the funeral as fast as she could. She went home, she went into her bedroom, and she knelt down and she began to pray. Not for peace or strength in this difficult time, but instead, she prayed for her daughter's ghost to appear to her and tell her what was wrong. And for the next month, that is all Mary Jane did. She was obsessed with this idea that she needed to basically conjure her daughter's ghost to tell her what this thing was that was wrong. And so that was why she was acting totally crazy. All she did was pray and then look for signs that her daughter's ghost had come or was on her way. And so she'd be up all night, kind of looking around, hoping her daughter would suddenly appear. And then when she would go outside, the reason she was muttering is because she was still praying under her breath. And she was always looking over her shoulders because she thought her daughter would appear any moment. And then, finally, one night in the middle of February, so this is a month into Mary Jane's attempts to conjure her daughter's ghost, She was in her room, she was praying like she normally did with all of her candles lit, and all of a sudden, as she's kneeling down praying, this bright light appears in the middle of her room. And as this light suddenly appeared, the room began to get really cold. And Mary Jane is staring at this light thinking, this is my daughter. But then just as quickly as the light and the cold that came with it had appeared, it disappeared. And so Mary Jane was both really excited because she felt like, okay, the prayers are working. That had to be my daughter's ghost or some sign that my daughter's ghost is going to come here. And so Mary Jane just doubled down on her prayers. She knew she was close to getting her daughter to show up. And so over the next 2 days, that bright light would appear 2 more times, and each time it would just quickly disappear. But again, Mary Jane is thinking, okay, something's happening. My prayers are working. And then finally, on the 4th night, as Mary Jane is in her bedroom praying, the light appears in the middle of her room. It starts to get cold. But then instead of the light disappearing, Mary Jane would describe seeing her daughter kind of step out of this light and suddenly appear in the room. Mary Jane said that her daughter was dressed all in black and her skin was very pale and her eyes were these dark pits and her hair was straight down right over her shoulders and she was staring at her mother. And Mary Jane, when she saw this, even though she had been trying for a month to get her daughter's ghost to appear, now that it seemed to be happening, she was terrified. And so Mary Jane began backing up right as this ghost begins walking towards Mary Jane. But then Mary Jane, as she's up against the wall, tells herself, you have to be strong. You need to talk to the ghost. You need to figure out what's wrong. And the only question that Mary Jane was able to come up with was, how did you die? And when she asked this question, Zona's ghost came to a stop. And then when Zona opened her mouth, dirt poured out. And then with a raspy, low voice, she began to tell her mother a story. She told her that Erasmus appeared to be this wonderful person to the community, but behind closed doors, he was a monster. He hit her and screamed at her over the littlest things, and then on the night of January 22nd, so one day before Zona would be discovered at the base of the stairs by Erasmus's helper, Zona's ghost would tell Mary Jane that Erasmus had become enraged at Zona over the food she had made that night for dinner. He had wanted meat, and she had made something else, and so he was furious. And when Zona tried to tell Erasmus that she would make more food, or there was other food for him to eat, to just please calm down, Erasmus stood up and he grabbed Zona by the neck and he lifted her off the ground. And right at this moment in this story that Zona's ghost is telling Mary Jane, the ghost would stop speaking. And this look of abject terror would come across the ghost's face, as if she was suddenly reliving this moment that happened with Erasmus. And as she's standing there with this horrible look on her face, the ghost began to levitate off the ground, and then it opened its mouth. And as it did, no sound came out, but instead, it was like all the air in the room was getting sucked into this ghost's open mouth. And then all of a sudden, there was this loud cracking sound as the ghost's head suddenly violently whipped around 180 degrees, but the ghost's body was still facing towards Mary Jane. And after this happened, Mary Jane is sitting there totally dumbstruck, and the ghost suddenly drops back down onto the ground, still with their chest facing Mary Jane, but their face pointing behind them. And then Zona's ghost turned around and began walking out of the room, and because she had turned her body around, that meant her head, which was facing the wrong way, was now oriented towards Mary Jane again, and Mary Jane would say the ghost was smiling, and then right before
That was close, wasn't it? That was close. I'm not going to start over. I'm just going to keep playing. And after the podcast finished, I'm going to get up out of here. But thank you guys for watching. Let's get back to the podcast. That was close. I'm going to come back and I'm going to hit 100,000. I'm going to come back probably tonight and I'm going to hit 100,000. Watch.
before Zona's ghost left, she would say to her mother, "Now do you see what he did to me?" And then Zona just vanished, and the room became warm again, and Mary Jane, who was suddenly feeling so exhausted, just sat down on the bed and wept. Mary Jane had, the next morning, promptly gotten up and rushed to the prosecutor's office and told him the story of seeing her daughter's ghost and how the ghost had told her that Erasmus had throttled her and that was what killed her. Now, the prosecutor was really moved by Mary Jane's story, but it was when he rushed to the doctor to ask about re-examining Zona's body to see if she had marks on her neck from where she could have been throttled, That was when the doctor actually told the prosecutor that when he did the examination of Zona's body on the day she was found, he would say that Erasmus spent the entire examination at the head of the bed, cradling Zona's head and brushing her hair. But now that he was thinking about it, he could have been covering up her neck with the hair. And then also they thought about the funeral when, right before Zona was lowered into the ground, Erasmus placed a scarf claiming it was his wife's favorite around her neck when she was buried. Again, perhaps trying to conceal the fact that there were marks on her neck. And when they did exhume Zona's body and they removed that scarf that Erasmus had placed, they would see there were marks all over her neck that looked like fingerprints. And then upon further examination, they would see that her neck was actually dislocated and that her windpipe had been crushed. Erasmus would be arrested for the murder of his wife just minutes after the doctor and prosecutor, basically at the same time, saw the marks on Zona's neck during their re-examination. During Erasmus's trial, Mary Jane would take the stand and she would tell the story of her daughter's ghost coming to her and explaining that Erasmus had killed her. And the testimony was so compelling that the jury found Erasmus guilty, even though there was no motive. Basically, they convicted him on the strength of Mary Jane's ghost story. Erasmus would be sentenced to life in prison, but he would die just 3 years after being incarcerated from a mystery illness that passed through the prison. It would also turn out that Erasmus had been married 2 times before marrying Zona. One of his wives had divorced him for being abusive. The other wife died in a freak accident when she was helping Erasmus fix their chimney when all of a sudden a brick fell loose and hit her in the head. Today, there is a plaque right near the cemetery in West Virginia where Zona was buried that reads in part, "Only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer."
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, not just this one, but also Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform, and you'll find all.
All right, that's it. Thank you for joining. You guys have a great day, and hopefully you come back.